Hello everybody. Today we are talking a little bit about what the enslaved people would have been doing in the back of the house. So we're going to focus on the kitchen garden, and we're kind of going to use this as a little bit of an illustration as we think about what types of gardens they may have had in their homes, because enslaved people had different types of ways that they got their nutrients aside from the rations that they were given. So we're going to talk about this a little bit, and then we're going to go into the smokehouse and check that out and see some of the things that were going on there. So we're going to focus on the garden first. And going through the WPA slave narratives, we find a lot of information about the ways that the enslaved people lived in this area. While we don't have a lot of information on the people who were here and here at Hunter's home, we do have some information that comes from the WPA slave narratives that kind of gives us a little bit of idea of what was being grown, whether or not they had their gardens around their cabins that they lived in, or if they tended to just one huge field of, kitchen crops and things for the home itself, like for the plantation itself. And so it kind of ran the gamut of different types. So what we know is that kids worked in the kitchen's gardens, and there were adults that worked in the kitchen gardens as well, and they would have done several different things. They would have been here, of course, planting and the like. You will read letters and memoirs and records that people kept logbooks of their homes, because they kept track of all this stuff. They had to know, since this was their grocery store. They couldn't run to Walmart if they happened to run out of something. They had to make sure that they were very careful about this kind of thing. And so they had to keep an eye on what they were doing and logging all that information and how much yield a crop got and all that stuff. So we're going to see in those log books and those letters and such where a mistress of a plantation or the owner is going to say, oh, well, we put back 15 quarts of tomatoes or something like that, and she's saying that we put that back. But like I said in the other videos, it's not her that's doing it, it's the enslaved people that she has doing that kind of thing. So that's going to be the people like Susan, if Susan's out here working, or Peggy if Peggy happens to be out here working for the day. Patience, if it's not laundry day and she needs to come out here and do some of this work, and it's not field crop day or cultivating or anything like that, they would be the ones doing this. And then again, I keep naming off these people that we have, because those are the only list of names that we have for the people who lived out here. We have to keep in mind as we're going through and talking about this stuff, that there were 42 enslaved people here. So George and Minerva Merle owned, and George and Amanda Merle owned 42 people by the time the Civil War started. So we're missing quite a few people off of that list, and we're currently searching for anybody that we can find. But so they worked in the kitchen gardens. They also not only worked in the kitchen and watched after children, some of them that we see, but they also worked in the kitchens whenever it was time to start preserving the stuff for the winter. So you're going to see stuff out here that they grow, and right now we've left it fallow for the last year so that we can kind of let the soil amend itself and everything. And so they're going to be doing that kind of thing too. So they know, okay, well, we planted beans in this plot last year, so we're going to have to plant something else in it this year, because those beans gave it the nutrients that we need for something a little bit more high impact on the soil. And here's another illustration. We have our garlic and things out here, and we have leeks that we plant as well. And you'll see that we kind of put hay up over it, because these things are cold hardy, so they're going to be okay in the cold, and they'll continue growing, and we'll be able to harvest some really good stuff. But we just have to make sure that the frost doesn't get to certain parts of it. And so that's one of the things that the enslaved people would have done, is they would have had to cover them up with hay or straw, things like that. And then if you guys have been out here in past years, you will have seen when we had the raised beds out here, we put big hoops over the beds, because that kept our cold hardy vegetables from dying, because the frost is not going to be able to get onto it. And so the enslaved people would have been in charge of doing that as well. And they're going to harvest all the stuff that's needed. And in your gardens, you're not just going to see lovely rows of pole beans and things like that. You're going to see all sorts of stuff out here. So it's not going to be quite as weedy as it is right now, because we have let it run to kind of take care of the nutrients of the soil and things. But you're going to see herbs, and you're going to see flowers and things like that, because they were using this kind of stuff. And on top of that, from some of the things that we've been reading, so what happens is the enslaved people get a ration generally. For the most part, I'm finding that the rations they get, they are going to be corn and meat, things like that, staple crop things that the Merles or the person who owns them is going to have in abundance. And those are the things that they're going to be using to give their enslaved people as rations. And then their enslaved people will tend a garden. And so they will either tend the garden, that is the large one that belongs to the family, and then they get some rations of the vegetables from there, or they have their own gardens out by their in their slave community, the enslaved community that they have somewhere on the property. And so we don't know how it was here, and there were several different types of ways that they did this back then. And so until we find more evidence, which we're looking for, we're not really going to know. If you look back here, you can see there's the spring house there, and there's a giant catalpa tree next to it. And we have we're focused on that area back behind there because from some of the information that we get, we find that people have said that they think the enslaved cabins were directly behind the spring house. And there's some land back there that's not good for growing. So they're not going to put their homes, they're not going to build on places that that's going to be able to be put in cultivation, especially when we think about the fact that this area back here was the apple orchard, and we have photographs that show that footprint. We'll be able to upload that to social media at some point in time. And we have in the past, but you know, we'll add that again. And so we're thinking that the enslaved community was probably back here, and then somewhere in this area directly back behind here. So you see on this side of the area is where George Ross's Rose Cottage was, and then somewhere here on that hill back behind the creek is where Arch Campbell's place was, and that is where the overseer lived. And so we're thinking that the enslaved cabins were somewhere in that area there, but not up high on the hill, because that's where the terrace where the apples were going to be. And so we've walked that area off, and it looks like it might be large enough for them to be able to establish a small garden. Their gardens likely are not going to be any bigger than this. They're likely not going to be as big as this unless it's a community garden tended by all of the enslaved people out there, which, you know, that's a thing that they could do as well. And so, you know, this is the kind of thing. But we're also reading through the WPA slave narratives and things like that, that they also were really smart about foraging for things too. So they go out and they forage for wild greens, they get berries, they, you know, this is probably gonna be something the kids learn how to do, because the younger kids generally don't have, especially if it's before they have to start working, they're going to be able to go foraging for some of these things while the adults and the older kids are working on other things. And so they're foraging for wild potatoes and things like that they're able to get. And, you know, they know what this stuff is. Also, they're getting their medicine from this too. So a lot of the narratives that I'm reading and a lot of the reports that I'm getting show that, you know, they had doctors within their communities, you know. And it kind of lets us understand that whenever the people who were enslaved, you know, it seems like sometimes that we are taught that the people who were enslaved came over here and they were taught everything once they got over here, and that's just simply not true. They had skills with them when they came over to this continent. They already knew how to be doctors. They already knew how to dye their clothing and weave and make clothes and things like that. This was something that they already had a firm grasp of. And so whenever they got here, they already knew how to do those things. The materials that they worked with were probably different, you know. So they're going to have plants that are native to this area that were not native to Africa, and that were not native to back east, where, you know, if they're second and third generation over here, then they're probably not going to be super familiar with the things that were back in Africa, but they already had the knowledge for some of those things. And if they were able to establish those family ties here on plantations, they were able to pass that knowledge to their children, to their family members, or to the other enslaved people in their communities with them. So that's one thing that we really need to keep in mind, is that the people who were who were enslaved, they were not taught everything when they came here. They may have been apprenticed for some things, but they had knowledge themselves that they used to survive whenever they were living in captivity, in enslavement. So they were, you know, captive people who were living here who already had knowledge to work with. And so that's another important thing. So they're going to be utilizing the herbs and the plants and things here to help to treat themselves, because what happens if, so the mistress of the plantation generally is the person who handles the illnesses of the slaves, of the enslaved people. All right, what happens if she is a jerk and somebody is really sick and you don't, you know, and an enslaved person needs to take care of that other person and they have the knowledge to do that? They're not going to ignore it and let the mistress just go ahead and let them die out of, you know, neglect. They're going to do what they have to do to make sure that that enslaved person lives. And so they're going to help one another out, and if they have that knowledge, they're going to make that medicine and they're going to help to heal them and take care of them. That's what they did. They took care of each other, you know, a lot of the times. And that's why one of the harder things to understand about this time is that whenever they were going to punish somebody, one of the enslaved people, a lot of times they wouldn't punish the person who did whatever wrong they decided that had happened. They would punish another enslaved person. And that's another thing about people who ran away. You know, it was harder to run away for people because they knew that if they did, then the people that they cared about back on the plantation were the ones that were going to bear the brunt of that punishment. So that's another thing to think about as well. All right, so we have things like this. You have trellises and such. This right here is what we use to let our cucumbers grow up on. It's easier to pick and they can't hide as well as they do, we found, whenever we let them grow longwise. And so we build things like this, and that would be something that the enslaved people would have to do. You know, maybe the children would be the ones handling those things because the older people would have to be making the repairs on the house and building things like that. So that's here in the kitchen garden. And then here's another example here. So this is mullein. This is an herb or a plant that everybody, you know, who would have grown up here would have known about. It's good for breathing difficulties and things like that. Also, after about 2 years, it produces flowers on it. That's really good as a sedative. It works kind of like chamomile does and helps you sleep. But the roots of this plant and the leaves of this plant are really good for helping with bronchial issues, asthma, things like that. Kind of helps it. You can make teas out of it, tinctures out of it. I've known people who've smoked blends with the leaves, and that's kind of helped alleviate some of the pain that they were dealing with. And so it's things like this that they're going to know about. And, you know, the mistress of the plantation is likely going to know about that kind of stuff too. Like we were talking about with Eliza and her children in that video. We talked about some of the things that she would have done. All right, so that is our kitchen garden, and I think I'm going to go ahead and end this one here, and then we'll have a second one up about the smokehouse, because this is already a little bit long and sometimes people don't like to sit there for 30 minutes listening to me yammer on. So we'll go ahead and end that here, and then the next video you see is going to be our smokehouse. Thank you for watching.